Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's GP Strategies webinar. My name is Kayla Roth, Marketing Manager for GP Strategies, and I am happy to be your host for today's event. If you've joined us before, we are very glad to have you back, and if this is your first session with us, well, a big welcome goes out to you. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Greg Long.
Hello.
Hi, Greg, and let me go ahead and introduce you. I'm trying to get my slides are not moving at the moment. There we go. So Greg Long is the Vice President of Organizational Excellence at GP Strategies. Greg joins us with more than 25 years of experience providing consulting services to numerous firms in the U.S. and overseas. His work has focused on improving organizational and individual performance through conceptualizing, designing, and developing strategic solutions for various communities. These programs have led to increases in business results and individual performance measures. So, Greg, we are so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kayla. Glad to be here.
I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
All right. Thanks, Kayla, very much. A couple more quick background things as Kayla introduced things and got us kicked off here. As many of you are, we are sheltering in place, and we happen to be in rural Pennsylvania, which is a beautiful place to be. The one drawback is that there is a train track not too awful far, so I apologize in advance if the train company decides to run some trains through here and make some background noise, but we'll deal with that as we go. So let's get started, and we'll just jump into this. Here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the situation that we all find ourselves in, and then we're going to talk about some factors that influence organizational performance, both internal and external. And the external ones are the ones that we're going to concentrate most of our time on today, the things that you really can't control, but frankly are the things that should shape your thinking about strategy and how you should be changing your strategy and evolving your strategy in this crazy time. We'll talk about a couple of bottom line conclusions, and then we'll see, hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A and discussions at the end. So we always appreciate and enjoy learning from the folks that join these webinars and as much as what we share. So with that, we're in a new normal. You've probably already heard this a couple times, that disruption is the new normal. And it's going to change a lot. It's going to change a lot frequently. And we need to get used to that level of change and disruption and 180-degree shifts and so forth. The question is, are you going to see that as a challenge or an opportunity? Is that a barrier, or is that a door that's opening for you in your organization to think about things perhaps in a new and different way? A long time ago, I heard an adage that has stuck with me forever, and it probably always will, which is that adversity does not build character, it reveals it. So when you put somebody in a stressful situation, you're not building them to be better able to handle stressful situations. You're going to learn about their character in the way that they do handle that stress. And so in that vein, the great pandemic crisis of 2020, the COVID-19 mess that we find ourselves in, is revealing something about the character of organizations. It's revealing the way people think, the way that organizations treat their people, the way that leaders decide things, and things that were invisible are now visible in a huge way. And so we're learning a lot about ourselves, but we're also learning a lot about our competition. And if we take the time to step back a little bit, I think we can use this as an opportunity to see what our competition is doing and how they react to situations. We think about things in terms of sort of three links in the value chain. Before strategy, there's purpose. And there's a lot of research about how purpose-driven companies do better, achieve higher profit margins, have better retention, fill in the blank. We're not going to talk a lot about that today, but just dig into that if you haven't already, the notion of a purpose-driven organization. Following on purpose, then strategy. And frankly, if a company doesn't know their purpose, then a great strategy won't really help. A strategy won't replace a well-defined and widely understood purpose. And in the same way, after strategy comes the execution of that strategy, and well-executed tactics don't take the place of a coherent strategy. So let's assume, for purposes of our discussion today, that as Simon Sinek would phrase it, you know your why, your organization's purpose, and let's look at the next two steps, strategy for achieving that purpose and the operationalization of that strategy in terms of execution. So here are those factors that I alluded to earlier. External factors and internal enablers is how we think about them. The external factors are the things that should guide and shape our thinking about our strategy. The internal enablers are things that enable us or help us execute that strategy that we've decided on. So those are the two groupings that we tend to think about things in. So let's dig into them a little bit. We're going to start for just a couple minutes on the internal side, and then we'll shift our focus to the pandemic's effect on the external side and look at those. So the internal enablers that we look at, the way that we think about performance of individuals and teams in an organization, fall into these 6 buckets. And there's other ways that you can divide these up. There's a 4-box model and a 8-box model, but any way you think about it, these are the things that go into enabling individual and team performance in an organization. And one way to do is to think about them in terms of questions. So here are the question view of things. Are the goals, the objectives, the expectations clearly known? Are the outcomes for each individual job and each team job clearly identified and communicated? Do people know what they're supposed to do? Do they have the skills, knowledge, and mindset to do those things that they're supposed to do? And then does the organization have the capacity to do those things? Do we have the right number of people in the right roles and the right jobs and so forth? And have we given them the tool system and information resources that they need in order to succeed, in order to perform with competence? And then have we established the right work processes, created the right environment, the right culture, and so forth? And then lastly, and certainly not least, have we put in place the right motivations, incentives, and consequences, both positive and negative, in order to help individuals do the things that they're supposed to do? And I'll let you in, and we're not going to talk a lot more about the internal things, but I will let you in on kind of a practice secret. The folks on the front line have usually figured it out. The individuals who are, whether it's customer facing or on the shop floor or whatever the situation may be in your organization, they're the ones who have figured these things out and can tell you whether or not you've achieved them well. So, as I said, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about this notion of clear aim, outcomes, and expectations. And the question that we ask in looking at internal performance of organizations and people and teams is, do individuals know these things? Has the organization clearly communicated them all the way through, clean line of sight, to the front line of the organization? And it should go without saying, but unfortunately in too many cases it doesn't, is that the implication there is that leaders know them first. And that's not always the case. And that's the question that kind of haunts a lot of organizations in terms of strategy. Is the strategy clear? Are the goals and objectives and outcomes of the organization clear? Do people really know where the organization is going? And then you can communicate that through to the front line. So what we're going to do is take a look at the external factors now that shape leaders' thinking about that strategy. So that's where we'll focus the rest of our time. So here are the external factors and the way that we group them. Again, there's other ways to group them. We like this way. It makes it pretty crystal clear what you're thinking about. Competition, political, legislative, economic situation, the social situation. We'll talk about that a lot. That's a key one right now in this pandemic. Technology, the environment that we're working in, and so forth. And all those things are are factors that influence business strategy that leaders should be thinking about in terms of shaping that strategy. So let's take a look at those in our current situation. Competition. This is a sad one in a lot of ways. For many organizations, there's some competitors that will be gone. There's some new ones. All of your competition, including your organization, are going to be making moves as they interpret the new landscape that they're working in. There's this notion that we all talk about now called the essential worker. Well, that transcending that is this notion of essential work. And what does that really mean to a given organization in a given industry and how they should be thinking about things? So there are a lot of factors that go into this. The key that I would offer for this particular one is that this is a time when you can step back and take a look at your competition. Perhaps you also want to look in a mirror and shine a light on how you're doing with some. But the key for our discussion today is that you should be taking a look at this as an opportunity to evaluate your competition as part of your shaping your strategy. So let's take a look at some of the rest of these. This one's frustrating. The whole notion of political and legislative, because we don't know exactly what people are doing. We don't know what governments are doing. And your own philosophy is going to have a big influence on how you view what's going on in the government. Will you say that what people have done been overreach? Will you say it's been about right? Will you say it's been not strong enough? And that could vary by location, by country, by state in the U.S., by county within a state, by city within a county even. It's been interesting to look at how things are being treated by different places and different government organizations in terms of what's here. One thing that's been interesting is that there's been in the U.S. and I know in other countries pretty significant financial outlays to help people and businesses get through this time. Well, that bill's going to come due at some point. So what's that going to do to the tax situation? How's that going to affect things? And these, again, are all things that we need to be thinking about as we shape our strategy and where we're going and what we're doing and what we're thinking about things. Okay, next area, economic. Consumer sentiment is changing dramatically. All kinds of things are going on. Everything's being rewritten. The notion of how people shop has changed. The notion of how much money people have. The reality about savings versus investment versus spending is all being rethought now. Customer financial situations have all changed. Liquidity issues for organizations have all changed. In some cases, there's less money. In some cases, there's different sources and different uses of money. And so the economic conditions are something that are going to have a major impact on how you think about your strategy and going forward. The stock market was up dramatically, it's down dramatically, and now it's kind of back in the middle. And if you know exactly where it's going to go next, please message me because I don't have a clue, but I would sure like to know. We're kind of in a quandary on that one. Social. This is the one that I think is the most important for us to think about a little bit. And I would argue or offer that this is largely a social pandemic. There's some medical drivers behind this, but the reality is that the biggest impact and driver of the pandemic and the sheltering in place orders and everything else are social. Couple that with the fact that organizations are social creatures. Culture comes from the myriad actions and decisions that leaders take, which creates a social environment. And things are changing dramatically. There's an old statistic that I read that 3/4 of managers did not want remote work for their teams because, quote, they didn't trust that their teams would put in a full day of work. Well, all of a sudden now people are finding out that not only do they put in a full day, but they put in more than a full day, and that whatever day they're putting in is more productive oftentimes than it was. I actually read an article last week that said that there are a lot of organizations that are now questioning the purpose of an office at all. And if they could get rid of the real estate costs associated with an office, how much better off would they be? Well, that's a cost question, but there's also some social implications in both directions of that decision. So the notion of social distancing, new attitudes about things. One of the things I want to highlight here in this social context is the notion of trust. And if there's one issue that will drive us through and beyond this pandemic, I believe it's going to be trust. And that's going to be a big challenge. And I'll give you a couple of examples by contrast of what I mean. On March 26th, in the middle of this craziness, the U.S. unemployment figures were just announced, and there were 3.3 million new unemployment applications, which was an astounding number. And in the middle of that, the CEO of Visa, Al Kelly, came out and announced to the company and to the market that Visa would make no COVID-related layoffs in the year 2020. And his quote was, "There's enough sadness in the world, and already too many families have been impacted by job losses. I have no interest in contributing to that." So think about that from a statement by a leader of an organization and what that says to the people of that organization and how they're going to be treated both through and beyond this crisis. Now, flip that around from the employee's perspective. How are they going to treat the company if Al Kelly came out and said, "Hey, we as a company need your help"? How are they going to react to that? I think that there's this notion of trust and loyalty become a major factor. By contrast, there's a fairly successful startup that's been written up a bunch of times very, very glowingly. I won't mention their name, but they had about 1,000 employees when this started. And at about the same time as Al Kelly made his announcement, 400 of the company's employees received the Zoom meeting invitation. And it was just titled COVID-19 Update. So they joined the call, and after about 5 minutes of dead air, so 5 minutes after the appointed time, a voice came on, the audio-only call, and said that COVID-19 has had a massive impact on our business, and it has forced our leadership team to make extremely difficult and painful decisions, one of which is to eliminate a number of roles at this company. Everyone on the call is included in that list. And then the meeting ended. And so 400 people were notified by a one-way Zoom call that they were laid off. So if you think about that in the context of trust and loyalty, how is that going to engender in that organization? So something to think about there, and how to look at what your customers are doing. Technology. Technology is an interesting one because oftentimes crises create new opportunities. We won't linger too long on this. We all know that video conferencing obviously is now being accepted in a new and amazing way. Will that lead to telehealth? Will that lead to the lack of office space? Will that lead to new work processes? Those are things that in your industry and for your organization, you're going to have to take an interesting look at. One thing that I've been thinking about a little bit of late, and I don't know how to process it completely, but this notion of 3D printing, which up until now has largely been a little bit of a novelty, but given the need for what I'll call self-healing supply chains, is 3D printing a technology that's now going to take off? And how will that affect your organization, your industry, your competitors? Some interesting things to ponder there. And I'm sure that in your situations, there's other similar kinds of technologies that may drive you one direction or another that you need to be thinking about for your strategy. The environment, the business climate in which we work. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So everything's changing dramatically. In some sectors are going to change permanently, and we'll have to watch and see how that plays out. One interesting one, for example, is the whole energy sector. About 6 years ago, my wife and I moved off the grid, and we spent half our time on a sailboat and half our time in an RV, traveling and meeting folks and doing all kinds of things, which we incredibly enjoyed. But the alternative industry field that we're very familiar with is changing dramatically because it's largely small businesses and not essential, actually, the way that most governments are looking at it. So the business environment within which you're operating is changing pretty dramatically through this thing as well. So those are the 6 factors. Our goal here is not to tell you what your strategy should be. Our goal here is to get you to look at these 6 things and look at your competitors in each of those 6 lenses and help you shape your decisions and your strategy going forward. I will leave you with a couple of thoughts here. One of which is that very few things are going to be black and white. Most things are going to be more or less. They're going to be shifts in emphasis. I think we'll see more home offices, more virtual meetings, more self-healing supply chains, those kinds of things. I think we're probably going to see a lot less travel to in-person meetings, a lot less single source, single point of failure, just-in-time supply chains. And I'll make a prediction that we'll see less time card-based work as more people start to think about the notion of outcome-based work and outcome-based roles and the value that people are producing rather than the time that they're investing to produce it. So some interesting things to think about in that regard. Bottom line, I think trust and relationships are going to rise to the fore. I think every organization is going to have to look in a mirror and see how well they've done at building or destroying trust, at building or destroying relationships. And I would encourage you to take a look at your competitors and how they're doing the same thing. And then obviously innovation and agility are going to be new strategies and how we survive this crazy time that we're in. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. I'll see you, Kayla. Have any questions come in that we could address real quick before we sign off?
Yes, there were a few questions. Again, if you have a question for Greg, go ahead and put that in the Q&A module at this time. Before I jump into those, though, I do want to remind everyone, we went over a lot in the last 20 minutes, or Greg did anyways, and there's still more information to discuss. I do encourage that you continue the conversation with him beyond today's session. His contact information is available in the slide deck. We'll be sending out a recording and the slides from today to the email address that you provided when you registered. So we'll be sure to get that out to you within the next 48 hours. So Greg, with all the uncertainty, what time frame should we be looking at for what's coming up and changes to our strategy? And also, how long should we plan on that strategy lasting?
Oh, gosh. It's an interesting question. I would argue that at this point that we should be thinking about strategy in fairly short terms because it's going to change and evolve. And if you're not agile, you're not going to be able to do that. However, the purpose that you established for your organization, and hopefully you already have one, is going to endure and probably is not going to change. If you think about one example, which is an interesting one, is Publix. They recently bought some over 400,000 pounds of produce and 40,000 gallons of milk and donated it to all the food banks rather than putting it in their stores. And their statement was that they have a purpose of helping our farmers and feeding our families. And so given that purpose, this was the obvious thing to do. We don't have a target of what we're going to do, but this fulfilled our purpose. So the purpose is enduring, the strategy changes. So in this case, it's probably going to be fairly short term.
Perfect. Well, this next question, you briefly touched on some of the internal things, and so this person just asked, don't the internal things that you listed also help shape the strategy?
They do, but indirectly. The internal factors are really enablers about how to execute the strategy. that you've decided is the right way to address your purpose. So obviously, if you don't have the capacity, that may influence your strategy, but indirectly. So I would argue that the enablers are things, the internal enablers are things that we have to appreciate, have to think about, but they shouldn't be drivers of our strategy, nor should they be establishers of our purpose.
Interesting. So the next question, so this person asked, considering organizations are learning environments as well, how can we promote among our collaborators to reflect about what we can learn from COVID-19? It's a
Well,
big question.
that's a great question. Um, if organizations are learning environments, in a couple of senses too, I would argue. One is that the individuals learn about the organization, and the organization, as a result, takes all those learnings and moves forward. And so, if you, the more transparent you are, I would argue, the more that learning is going to occur, and the more that trust and relationships will be built up rather than torn down. So, a couple of practical strategies is communicate well, communicate honestly, communicate often, with exactly what you're thinking, why you're thinking, and how you're going to address this, and what your options are. People are smart. They know what's going on. They read the news as well as anybody else, and they'll make informed decisions based on the information that they have. So this notion of trying to decide in secret and then announce is probably not a good tactic, as opposed to being transparent with what you're doing and how you're doing it. So that would be my honest opinion, which is to think more about the trust and relationships as part of that collaboration and learning process.
Well, thank you, Greg. We don't have any more questions that have come through, so I'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. I want to say thank you again to today's speaker, and thank you to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We do hope that you'll join us again for future webinars. Registration is available on our webinar page at gpstrategies.com. Our next webinar is actually tomorrow. We're hosting it with ATD, so we hope that you can join us for that one, and we have several more coming up throughout the month of May and into June. So we hope to see you on future webinars again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.